Hello dear students, this is lecture number 6, part 1 of the Cultural Studies course, and it's about Franz Fanon and national culture. Now, Fanon, whose dates you have on the slide, 1925, 1961, so it seems that he died at a young age of 36. It was a tragic event, his death was a tragic event, and it was caused by the disease of acute leukemia, which is ironic because the man was not just a writer, a philosopher, a psychiatrist, but also he was a revolutionary and a freedom fighter who participated in the Algerian War of Independence. He didn't die in war though, as we just said. He died of disease, but not before he left us a wealth of intellectual legacy that has influenced many critics, whether in post-colonial criticism or cultural criticism, and he was like one of the founders of this school of thought known as post-colonialism. The renowned Edward Said himself mentioned the name of Franz Fanon as one of the pioneers who wrote about colonial relations and was one of the guiding figures who influenced the thought of Said. In other words, who knows, maybe if it were not for Franz Fanon, Edward Said wouldn't have been able to write his masterpieces, Orientalism or Culture and Imperialism. Fanon was born in 1925 in one of the islands of the West Indies, the Martinique, and at the time of his birth, the Martinique was a French colony under French colonialism. As you know, France, one of the major colonial powers of the 19th century, had extended colonies in the West Indies, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia, among other places. And the French type of colonialism was called an assimilation type, which is one of the most vicious types of colonialism, because the French colonizer would try to erase, to completely delete or wipe out the original culture of the natives and try to enforce or impose the French culture on these colonized people, whether they are in Africa or South Asia or in the West Indies. Therefore, Fanon was born under this colonial rule. He was taught in French schools, and when he finished his high school, he went to France, which considered itself the mother country of all the French colonies. In France, being an outstanding scholar, he studied medicine at the University of Lyon, and he specialized in psychiatric medicine. Now, this was the time when he went to France, when he had the biggest shock of his life. He suddenly discovered the lie of the French colonialism. He discovered that although when he was in the Martinique, his fellow Martiniqueans and maybe even himself considered themselves as French citizens, when they went to France, they discovered that they were treated in a totally different way, and that the color of their skins, the black skins that they have, would like point them out as aliens, and that they would never be accepted as part of the French culture. This dilemma of the colonized people and how they lose their original culture and how they fail to like actually possess and gain the culture of the colonized was the first initiative that led to the book published in 1952, a book titled Black Skin, White Masks, that we will talk about later in the coming slides. Now, there was another colony. One of the French colonies was Algeria, and as a psychiatrist, Franz Fanon was sent to work in a major hospital in Algeria in 1953. He worked there till 1956, but during these 3 years he made even further negative and tragic discoveries about the reality of the colonial experience, so that he presented a letter of resignation, and he mentioned in his letter that psychiatric medicine is supposed to offer help and support to people who are feeling alienated or feeling that they don't realize their real identities and so on. And because the Arabs, the Algerians, are so oppressed by the French colonial regime, he feels that there is no use at all working as a psychiatrist under such circumstances. He expressed his feeling of the infutility, the uselessness of such work, and he wrote a resignation. Now, the French authorities, of course, were not about to accept such a resignation. They quickly fired him. He lost his job. He was fired. The resignation was not accepted, and he was given an ultimatum to leave the Algerian soil in the very short period of 48 hours or 2 days. But Franz Fanon had other plans. He had already secretively joined the classes of the Algerian liberation movement, and he simply disappeared with his fellow freedom fighters or revolutionaries fighting for the independence of Algeria in the Algerian mountains and deserts, and he fully joined this liberation struggle. So, this Martiniquean writer, psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary crossed so many countries in so many continents and became a freedom fighter, as we say, in a liberation war that seemed not to be his own, but he believed it to be his own. He believed that all wars of liberation should support each other. He believed that if he fights with the Algerians, this fight is going to help his people in the Martinique. It will help the African Americans who are fighting for their civil rights in the United States of America and who originally have been displaced from Africa centuries ago. And he also believed that this will help even the many independence movements that were taking place during the 1950s and the 1960s in Africa and all over the globe. We mentioned that Franz Fanon was not just a man of action, a freedom fighter and revolutionary, and he was not just a medical doctor specialized in psychiatry, but he was an author of a number of books that had a big impact on most of the philosophers and the critics who followed in his footsteps. Now, certain major themes were recurrent in all of Fanon's writings. For example, he would be writing about the psychological effects, including racism, the psychological effects of colonialism on both colonizer and colonized. He discussed this issue in his first book, a book that he wrote when he was just 27 years old. It was published in 1952. It was entitled Black Skin, White Mosques. In this book, Fanon discussed the novel idea that it is not just the colonizer or the colonized who suffered from psychological damage due to the colonial encounter, but actually both of them. On the one hand, the colonizer would have these feelings of superiority and of grandeur, would feel like a semi-god, would feel like the agent of civilization, carrying this white man's burden of bringing civilization to the colonized nations. Colonizers would be living the lie and believing this lie to be the truth. They would be in a state of denial, denying the exploitation and the economic and political oppression they are practicing against the original natives, the people of the colonized country. White man would be like trying to convince himself that actually he is bringing peace and civilization and prosperity, but subconsciously, the white man, the colonizer, would always know that this is not true, and that he's an alien, and that he would never belong in Algeria, even if he stays there for generations and generations. On the other hand, the colonized would suffer from the impact of the racism, the racist maneuvers and the racist strategies that the colonizer practices upon him, and would suffer maybe from an inferiority complex, would come to believe that colonized nations in Africa or in the Martinique or wherever are barbarians and savages and inferiors, would come, the colonized, to despise their own traditional culture and to despise their identity and to try to imitate the white colonizer, to try to be a copy of the French colonizer. But of course, the attempt to become a copy would never really succeed, and this would leave the colonized in a void. Loss of identity, loss of traditional cultural roots, and not gaining anything in place. This argument in the year 1952 was quite revolutionary. It was a novelty. maybe nowadays you as students of literature and literary as students of literature, you are like familiar with such terms as stereotyping and misrepresentation and so on, but not in the year 1952. So Fanon was one of the first to introduce such revolutionary terms. Another major theme that recurred frequently in the writings of Fanon was the theme of resistance, the wars of liberation, and the cultural interactions between colonizer and colonized. These themes were exemplified in another book entitled A Dying Colonialism. This is actually the title of the English translation of the book, because the book was originally written in French language, and it was L'Encinq de la Révolution Algérienne, or the fifth year of the Algerian Revolution. It was published in 1959, and in this book, Fanon showed himself to be a great believer in the will of the masses. He believed that despite all appearances, the oppressed nations, the colonized, they may be weaker from a military or political or economic point of view than the colonizer, but they are able to resist, and they should be able to resist and to fight for their liberation, for their right of self-determination, and for their independence. He also, in this book, mentioned a discussion about the nature of the cultural interaction between the colonizer and the colonized, and we will discuss further details about this book in coming slides. So now we have finished the first part of the work of Franz Fanon, and as you can see for yourselves, he is quite a special man, a man of action and a man of letters, a man who can carry a gun and hide in the mountains, engage in guerrilla warfare, fighting for the rights of people, even when these people belong to different cultures, because he actually was not an Arab Muslim like the other Algerian fighters who were his comrades, but he embraced their identity because he believed in the fraternity between all the oppressed. He believed that regardless of your original culture or your language or your religion, the oppressed should be helping each other in order to reach their goals of freedom. This is the end of the first part of Lecture 6, and thank you for listening and for being attentive, and we will continue this lecture in another presentation. Thank you. Goodbye.